I never imagined the day would come when I would be locked out of the house my husband built with his own hands. My suitcase sat on the porch, the door closed behind me, and the woman who married my son told me I no longer belonged there. In that moment, I realized something painful. Sometimes betrayal does not come from strangers. It comes from the people who walk through your front door and slowly claim everything you love. What happened next changed my family forever. But to understand how it all led to that moment, I have to start from the beginning of the story. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Linda Whitaker, and I am 63 years old. For most of my life, I have lived in the same wooden house beside Lake Superior, in a quiet town called Lakewood in northern Minnesota. When people pass through our town, they usually say the same thing. It feels peaceful here. The air smells like pine trees and cold water, and the wind coming from the lake carries a quiet that city people rarely understand. For me, that quiet was never loneliness. It was home. My husband, Daniel Whitaker, built most of this house with his own hands almost 40 years ago. Back then, we had very little money, but Daniel always believed that if you worked hard enough, you could build a life piece by piece. The house started small, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but every few years he added something new: a wider porch facing the water, a second-floor bedroom, a wooden dock that stretched gently into the lake. Every nail, every board, carried a memory of the life we built together. 11 years ago, Daniel died suddenly from a heart attack. One moment we were drinking coffee at the kitchen table, and the next moment the world felt unbearably quiet. I remember standing in the hallway that night, listening to the wind outside, and thinking the house had never felt so empty. Grief has a strange way of echoing through familiar rooms. My son Ethan was 22 at the time. He had just started working for a construction company in town, and like many young men his age, he could have easily left Lakewood for a bigger city. But he did not. Instead, he looked at me one evening after the funeral and said he would stay. Not because he had to, but because family mattered more than distance. From that moment on, the house slowly filled with life again. Ethan and I developed a quiet routine over the years. I usually woke before sunrise and made coffee in the kitchen while the sky turned pale over the lake. Ethan would come downstairs later, still half asleep, and walk down to the dock to check on the little fishing boat he kept tied there. Sometimes I watched him from the porch and thought about how quickly children grow into adults. Most mornings I spent time in the garden behind the house. Daniel had loved hydrangeas, so over the years I planted dozens of bushes along the fence and around the porch. In the summer, the flowers bloomed in large, soft clusters of blue and white, bright against the dark green leaves. Caring for them gave me a sense of calm, like tending small living pieces of memory. Evenings were simple. Ethan returned from work covered in dust from construction sites, and we shared dinner at the same kitchen table where Daniel and I once sat together. We talked about ordinary things: the weather, the progress of Ethan's projects, or which neighbor had stopped by during the afternoon. Nothing dramatic ever happened, and that was exactly the way I liked it. After Daniel passed away, I believed my life had settled into a quiet rhythm that would never change. The house beside the lake felt like the final chapter of a long story, peaceful and steady. I thought the future would simply continue this way. But one autumn evening, Ethan walked through the door with a nervous smile I had never seen before. As we sat in the kitchen, he cleared his throat and told me something that would slowly change everything. He said he had met someone. Her name, he explained carefully, was Vanessa Caldwell. If you're still watching and this story has already caught your attention, comment number 1 below so I know you're here with me, because what seemed like a peaceful life beside the lake was about to change in ways I never expected. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. When Ethan told me he had met someone, I remember the way he looked down at the table as if he were a teenager again. My son had always been a steady, quiet man, not the kind who talked much about his feelings. Seeing him nervous that evening made me smile. He explained that her name was Vanessa Caldwell. She worked in real estate in Duluth, a city about an hour from our town. Ethan told me they had met through a mutual friend at a small gathering a few months earlier. At first, they spoke only occasionally, but over time they began seeing each other more often. As he described her, I could hear a kind of excitement in his voice that I had not heard in years. He said she was confident, hardworking, and very determined about her career. I listened carefully and nodded while he talked. After Daniel passed away, Ethan had spent so much time taking care of me that I sometimes worried he had forgotten to build a life for himself. So when he told me about Vanessa, my first reaction was happiness. Every parent hopes their child will find someone who brings light into their life. A few weeks later, Ethan asked if Vanessa could come to the house for dinner. I spent most of that afternoon preparing. I cleaned the kitchen from top to bottom and cooked one of the meals Ethan had loved since he was a boy. I even took out the ceramic plates Daniel and I had bought many years earlier during a trip to Wisconsin. I usually saved those plates for special occasions, and meeting the woman my son cared about felt important. Vanessa arrived just after sunset on a cool autumn evening. The wind coming off Lake Superior carried that sharp northern chill that always signals winter is not far away. When I opened the door, I saw a tall woman with dark hair and confident posture. She wore a long coat and boots that looked far more suited for a city sidewalk than a quiet lakeside town. Still, she greeted me warmly and thanked me for inviting her. At dinner, she was polite and engaging. She asked questions about my years as a school teacher and listened with interest when I told stories about the children I had taught. She laughed easily and seemed comfortable in conversation. Ethan looked relaxed beside her, and I could see how proud he felt introducing her to me. But during the meal, I began noticing something curious. Vanessa often glanced around the room, studying the walls, the windows, even the ceiling beams Daniel had installed decades ago. She asked when the house had been built and whether Daniel had constructed most of it himself. Then she asked about the land surrounding the property and how far the shoreline extended along the lake. At first, I assumed she was simply making conversation, yet the questions continued. She asked if homes around Lake Superior had been selling recently and whether people from bigger cities were buying property in the area. She spoke about tourism and how lakefront homes sometimes became valuable vacation rentals. She said the house had incredible potential if someone ever decided to renovate it. I smiled politely, but inside I felt a small ripple of discomfort. To me, the house was never a business opportunity. It was where Daniel and I raised our son. Every room carried memories that could not be measured in money. After dinner, Ethan and Vanessa stepped outside to look at the lake. I watched them through the kitchen window as they stood near the porch. Vanessa gestured toward the house while she spoke, pointing at the roofline and the deck as if imagining changes already taking shape. I told myself I was simply overthinking things. Vanessa worked in real estate, so of course she noticed details about houses. It was part of her job. Still, that quiet feeling in my chest did not completely disappear. Sometimes, the first signs of trouble arrive softly, hidden inside harmless questions. At that moment, I did not realize how important those questions would become. If you're still watching and feeling that something about Vanessa just doesn't sit right, Comment number 2 below to let me know you're following the story, because the questions she asked that night were only the beginning. Now, let's move on to chapter 3. About a year after that first dinner, Ethan told me he wanted to marry Vanessa. By then, she had become a familiar presence in our house. She visited nearly every weekend, sometimes arriving late Friday evening after driving from Duluth, and staying until Sunday afternoon. During those months, I tried to welcome her sincerely. I reminded myself that families grow and change, and that my son deserved a life beyond the quiet routine he and I had shared since Daniel died. The wedding took place the following spring in Lakewood. It was a small ceremony held in the community church just a few blocks from the lake. Friends from town attended, along with a handful of Vanessa's co-workers who drove in from the city. I sat in the front row and watched Ethan stand at the altar in a dark suit that made him look older than I remembered. He looked proud, nervous, and hopeful all at once. When Vanessa walked down the aisle, she carried herself with the same polished confidence I had noticed the first time she came to dinner. Everyone in the church seemed impressed by her elegance. I remember telling myself that Ethan had chosen someone strong and capable, someone who could build a future beside him. After the ceremony, we returned to the lake house for a modest reception. Neighbors brought casseroles and pies, and people stood on the porch laughing while the sun set over Lake Superior. It should have felt like a perfect day, yet somewhere deep inside me, I sensed that something in my life had quietly shifted. Soon after the wedding, Vanessa moved into the house permanently. At first, the adjustment seemed ordinary. Any new couple rearranges things when they begin living together. Vanessa suggested moving a few pieces of furniture to create more space in the living room. She brought several decorative items from Duluth, modern lamps, and framed photographs that replaced some of the older decorations Daniel and I had collected over the years. Ethan supported these changes easily. He said the house could use a fresh look after so many years. I tried to agree, but the changes did not stop with small decorations. Over the following weeks, Vanessa began removing furniture she described as outdated. One afternoon, I returned from the garden and discovered that the large wooden table Daniel had built in our garage decades earlier was gone. In its place stood a smooth modern table made of polished metal and glass. Vanessa explained that she had sold the old table through an online listing because someone in Duluth was willing to pay for it. She said the new one matched her vision for the room. I nodded quietly, though I felt something tighten in my chest. Daniel had built that table during one long winter when Ethan was still a child. Every scratch on its surface carried a memory of family dinners, school projects, and birthdays. Now, it was gone. Over time, Vanessa began treating the house less like a home and more like a project. She rearranged the living room again and started inviting a few clients to stop by when they were visiting the lake region. She worked in real estate, and she often spoke about property values and development opportunities along Lake Superior. Ethan seemed proud of her ambition. He did not notice how the language of business slowly replaced the language of family inside our home. One afternoon, I saw Vanessa walking slowly around the outside of the house while holding her phone up as if she were taking photographs. When I asked what she was doing, she smiled and said she enjoyed studying architecture. The explanation sounded harmless. Still, as the months passed, I began to realize something that troubled me more than the missing furniture or the rearranged rooms. Little by little, decisions about the house were being made without me. I still lived there. I still watered the garden and cleaned the kitchen. But the house beside the lake, the house Daniel and I had built together, was beginning to feel like a place where I was simply passing through. If you're still watching and starting to see how quickly a home can begin to feel unfamiliar, comment number 3 below so I know you're still with me. Because what I discovered next made me realize the changes in my house were not accidental. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. In the months after Ethan and Vanessa settled into the house as husband and wife, life slowly developed a rhythm that no longer felt like mine. Nothing changed all at once. Instead, the changes arrived quietly, like small shifts in the wind that you only notice after the weather has already turned. Vanessa worked from home more often than she did before the wedding. She converted the garage into a tidy office space where she placed a desk, two sleek chairs, and a large computer monitor. Sometimes clients stopped by when they were traveling through the area. They usually stayed only a short time, but their presence made the house feel different, less like a home and more like a place where business was conducted. Because of that, I began spending more time outside. I worked longer in the garden or walked down the lake shore where the cold water of Lake Superior rolled quietly against the rocks. Sometimes I visited neighbors simply to pass the afternoon. I never told Ethan that I felt in the way. I believed it was better to stay quiet than risk creating tension between him and his wife. Vanessa talked about property values frequently. During dinner, she often mentioned how lakefront homes were becoming popular with investors and tourists. She described how visitors from large cities were searching for quiet places along the northern shore to buy vacation houses. Ethan listened with interest, though he usually treated the subject casually, the way people do when they hear someone speaking about work. Still, I began noticing how often Vanessa studied the house itself. She sometimes measured spaces in the living room with a small tape measure she carried in her purse. Other times, she stood on the porch looking up at the roofline or the deck as if she were imagining something different from what already existed. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than usual after visiting a neighbor who lived 2 streets away. As I walked through the side yard toward the back gate, I heard Vanessa speaking on her mobile phone. She was standing near the porch, facing the lake, and she had not noticed that I had come home. At first, I paid little attention, but as I drew closer, I realized her voice sounded more formal than usual. She was speaking about the house. Vanessa mentioned the size of the property and the length of the shoreline. She described the wooden dock Daniel had built years ago and talked about how quiet the town was during most seasons. The conversation sounded less like casual discussion and more like the kind of professional explanation someone gives while describing a property. Then I understood that she was speaking with a real estate broker. My steps slowed as I listened from behind the corner of the house. Vanessa continued describing the location and the structure of the building. She explained that the house was not currently for sale, but that situations could always change. A moment later, she said something that made my heart beat faster. She said that eventually the property would belong to her. For a few seconds, I simply stood there, unsure whether I had heard correctly. The words sounded confident and deliberate, not like a joke or an offhand comment. I felt a sudden wave of disbelief move through me. I quietly stepped away before she could see me and went inside through the back door. For the rest of the afternoon, I tried convincing myself there must be some harmless explanation. That evening, when Ethan came home from work, I considered telling him what I had heard, but he looked tired and content as he sat beside Vanessa at the kitchen table. I did not want to shatter that moment. Instead, I mentioned the phone call gently. Vanessa smiled and said she had only been discussing general property trends with a colleague. Ethan agreed that it sounded like ordinary business conversation. I nodded and said nothing more. Yet that night, as I lay awake listening to the wind moving across the lake, one sentence kept repeating itself in my mind. Vanessa had sounded very certain, as if the house my husband built would one day belong to her. If you're still watching and wondering what Vanessa was really planning behind my back, comment number 4 below to let me know you're here, because the truth about her intentions was far more serious than I imagined. Now, let's move on to chapter 5. The conversation I overheard that afternoon near the porch never completely left my mind. I tried to convince myself that Vanessa had only been speaking professionally, the way real estate agents often do when they discuss properties. Still, the certainty in her voice lingered with me. It was not what she said that disturbed me most. It was how confidently she said it. In the weeks that followed, I focused on my usual routines in an effort to keep my thoughts calm. Each morning, I walked through the garden behind the house, watering the hydrangea bushes Daniel loved so much. Their blue blossoms were beginning to fade as autumn approached, but caring for them still gave me a sense of peace. Yet, I began noticing that simple tasks were becoming more difficult than before. Carrying the watering can from the porch to the flower beds left me strangely tired. Sometimes when I bent down to pull weeds, a wave of dizziness passed through me so suddenly that I had to steady myself against the wooden fence. At first, I blamed it on age. 63 years is not young, and the body often reminds us of that fact in quiet ways. But one afternoon, the weakness arrived without warning. I was kneeling near the back garden trimming dry leaves from the hydrangeas when the world around me seemed to tilt. The sound of the wind across the lake grew strangely distant, as if someone had closed a door between me and the outside world. My vision blurred, and the ground beneath my knees felt unsteady. I tried to stand, but my legs would not cooperate. The next thing I remember clearly was Ethan's voice calling my name. He had come home early from work and found me lying on the grass beside the garden bed. His face was pale with worry as he helped me into the truck and drove me to the clinic in town. The doctor ran several tests that afternoon. Afterward, he sat across from us in a quiet office and explained that my heart was showing signs of weakness. He said it was not immediately life-threatening, but it meant I needed rest and regular monitoring. Stress and overexertion could make the condition worse. Ethan listened carefully to every word. I could see the same protective concern in his eyes that he once showed when he was a boy, and I had a fever. For a brief moment, I felt reassured that no matter how much our lives had changed, he was still my son. When we returned home that evening, Vanessa greeted us in the kitchen. At first, she sounded sympathetic when Ethan explained the diagnosis. She said she hoped I would feel better soon and asked a few questions about the doctor's instructions. But as the conversation continued, her tone shifted towards something more practical. She began talking about how difficult it might be for someone with heart problems to live alone in a large house beside the lake. She mentioned that assisted living communities in Duluth offered professional care and constant supervision. According to her, those places were designed to make life easier for older people who needed medical attention. Ethan did not immediately disagree. Instead, he opened his computer later that night and began looking at websites for retirement facilities. I sat quietly at the kitchen table while they talked about options. Part of me understood that Ethan believed he was protecting me. Yet another part of me felt a quiet fear growing in my chest. Leaving this house would mean leaving the last place where Daniel's presence still lived. That night, I lay awake listening to the wind moving across Lake Superior. The doctor had spoken about protecting my health, but Vanessa's earlier words returned to me again. For the first time, I wondered if my illness might be exactly the opportunity she had been waiting for. In the days following my visit to the clinic, the atmosphere inside the house began to change in ways that were difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. Ethan became more attentive to my health. Every morning he reminded me to take the medication the doctor had prescribed and asked whether I had slept well. When he saw me carrying anything heavier than a small watering can, he gently insisted that I sit down and rest. His concern was sincere, and I could not fault him for it. Yet the constant reminders made me feel strangely fragile, as if my body had suddenly become something that needed supervision. Vanessa approached the situation differently. A few days after my diagnosis, I walked into the kitchen and found several brochures spread neatly across the table. Each one showed photographs of bright rooms filled with smiling older people sitting beside nurses or walking through landscaped courtyards. The titles spoke about comfort, security, and professional care. They were advertisements for assisted living communities. Vanessa explained that she had picked them up while visiting Duluth earlier that week. According to her, these facilities were designed to help older residents maintain independence while receiving medical supervision. She spoke calmly, as if she were describing something perfectly reasonable. Over the next several days, the brochures remained on the table. Sometimes Vanessa opened them while Ethan was nearby, pointing out the benefits of having trained staff available around the clock. She spoke about organized activities, quiet living spaces, and the peace of mind families could feel knowing their loved ones were properly cared for. Ethan listened carefully. I sat quietly during those conversations, folding my hands together on the table while the paper pages rustled softly between them. Part of me understood that Ethan believed he was considering responsible options, but another part of me felt as though the walls of my own home were slowly moving closer together. One evening, Ethan approached me gently after dinner. He suggested that perhaps we could visit one of the facilities together, just to see what it was like. He explained that it would not mean making any final decision. It would simply help us understand what possibilities existed if my health ever required additional care. His voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to avoid hurting another person's feelings. I told him I appreciated his concern. I explained that I was willing to follow the doctor's instructions and take things more slowly around the house. But the idea of leaving the lake house made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with my heart condition. This house held the life Daniel and I had built together. Every room contained memories that could not be packed into boxes or moved to another building. Vanessa responded in a calm but firm voice. She said health must always come before sentiment. According to her, the size of the house and the isolation near the lake could make emergencies difficult to manage. Her words sounded logical, but the certainty behind them unsettled me. In the days that followed, I began noticing small changes that deepened my unease. Vanessa rearranged storage spaces and talked casually about how much easier life might become once certain responsibilities were simplified. She mentioned possible renovations and improvements that could be made to the property in the future. Each remark sounded harmless on its own, yet together they formed a quiet pattern I could not ignore. One night, I stepped outside onto the porch long after the house had gone quiet. The wind moved across Lake Superior in long, cold waves that shimmered beneath the moonlight. I stood there for a long time, remembering the years Daniel and I spent building this place together. For the first time, a troubling thought settled clearly in my mind. Vanessa was not simply suggesting new arrangements for my health. She was waiting for the moment when I would no longer stand between her and this house. If you're still watching and can feel the tension building inside that house, comment number 6 below, so I know you're still with me, because the next chapter is where everything begins to unravel. Now, let's move on to chapter 7. Several weeks passed after the night I stood on the porch watching the wind move across Lake Superior. During that time, the house felt different, as if an invisible tension had settled into the walls. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface, yet every small conversation carried a quiet weight that had not existed before. Vanessa continued speaking about assisted living facilities from time to time. She never raised her voice or demanded anything directly, but the subject returned often enough that it no longer felt like a suggestion. It felt like preparation. I followed the doctor's instructions carefully. I rested more than I had before and avoided the heavier work in the garden. Still, I found myself moving through the house quietly, almost cautiously, as if I were trying not to disturb a life that no longer belonged entirely to me. Vanessa spent more time organizing documents in the garage office she had created. I often saw stacks of papers on her desk when I passed the open door. Sometimes she made long phone calls outside near the porch, where the wind from the lake carried her voice away, before I could hear much of what she said. Ethan seemed unaware of the subtle changes around him. He worked long days at construction sites and returned home tired in the evenings. When Vanessa talked about property markets or business matters, he usually listened politely without thinking much about it. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, reviewing messages from the bank. I noticed the expression on his face change slowly from calm concentration to quiet confusion. He stared at the screen for several seconds before scrolling through the page again. Finally, he looked up and asked me if I had recently spoken with any banks about the house. The question caught me completely by surprise. I told him immediately that I had not contacted any bank or financial office about the property. I had never even considered doing such a thing. The house had always been Daniel's and mine, and after his death, the legal documents remained exactly as they had been. Ethan nodded, but did not look reassured. He turned back to the computer and began checking several other notifications. The room grew very quiet except for the faint tapping of his fingers against the keyboard. After a few minutes, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen as if trying to understand something that did not make sense. He explained that a mortgage inquiry had been submitted using information about the house. According to the message from the bank, someone had recently requested details about the property as part of a possible loan application. Ethan said he had never filed such a request. A cold uneasiness settled in my stomach as I listened. For the rest of the evening, Ethan remained unusually silent. He searched through financial records and checked several documents connected to the property. I watched him from across the room, realizing that he was beginning to see something I had sensed for months. Later that night, he closed the laptop slowly and rubbed his forehead with one hand. The next morning, he left for work earlier than usual, but when he returned that evening, his expression carried a seriousness I had not seen before. He spent several hours in the living room reviewing papers and messages on his phone. Eventually, he stepped outside and made a long phone call that I could not hear clearly. When he came back inside, he looked thoughtful and distant, as though he had crossed some invisible line in his mind. He did not explain everything to me that night, but I understood one thing clearly. For the first time since Vanessa entered our lives, Ethan was beginning to question what had been happening inside his own home. And once doubt begins to grow, the truth rarely stays hidden for long. In the days after Ethan began reviewing the bank records, the house grew quieter than I had ever known it to be. Conversations between him and Vanessa became shorter, often ending with long silences that seemed to settle over the rooms like heavy fog. Ethan spent several evenings speaking privately on the phone in the living room. I did not hear every word, but I understood that he was discussing the property with a legal advisor in town. The seriousness in his voice made it clear that the situation was no longer just a misunderstanding. A few days later, he asked me a careful question while we were alone in the kitchen. He wanted to confirm that the house had remained in my name after Daniel died. I explained that Daniel's will had been very clear. The property had been transferred fully into my ownership many years ago. Ethan knew this, but hearing it again seemed to matter now in a way it never had before. After that conversation, Ethan became even more focused. One evening, he returned home carrying a folder filled with printed documents. He placed them on the dining table and studied them quietly for nearly an hour. I could see the tension in his shoulders as he turned each page. Later that night, he asked Vanessa to sit with him in the living room. I remained in the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes while listening to the soft murmur of their voices through the open doorway. Ethan explained that he had discovered several financial inquiries connected to the lake house. According to the bank, someone had attempted to gather information for a possible mortgage using the property as collateral. At first, Vanessa sounded calm, She suggested that the inquiry might have been related to general market research connected to her work in real estate. But Ethan continued speaking, his tone steady and controlled. He had received confirmation from the advisor that documents connected to the inquiry included a signature authorization under his name. The problem was that he had never signed those papers. For a moment, the house fell completely silent. Then Vanessa began explaining quickly that she had only been exploring possible financial opportunities. She said the loan idea had been meant to support future investments that could benefit both of them. According to her, she had simply wanted to study the options before presenting the idea to Ethan properly. Listening from the kitchen, I felt the weight of those words settle heavily in the air. Ethan remained quiet for several seconds before responding. His voice was not angry, but it carried a firmness I had not heard before. He told Vanessa that the house belonged to me and always had. Any financial plan involving the property would require my full consent. Vanessa's composure began to crack. She insisted that she had only been trying to help improve their financial future. She spoke about property value and long-term investment strategies, but Ethan did not seem persuaded. From where I stood, I could see the disappointment in his expression as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. The realization that his wife had acted without his knowledge had clearly shaken him. The conversation ended without shouting, yet the quiet finality of Ethan's decision filled the room. He said that no loan, mortgage, or investment connected to the house would ever happen without my approval. For the first time since Vanessa entered our lives, the balance inside the house shifted, and as I watched my son standing there with calm determination, I realized that the truth Vanessa had tried to hide was finally beginning to surface. If you're still watching and wondering how this confrontation will finally end, comment number 8 below to let me know you're still here, because the next part brings the final outcome of everything that happened in that house. Now let's move on to the conclusion of the story. The morning after Ethan confronted Vanessa felt strangely quiet. The tension that had filled the house for so many months had not completely disappeared, but it had changed its shape. The uncertainty that once hovered over every conversation had been replaced by something more solid. The truth had finally been spoken aloud, and once truth enters a room, it has a way of changing everything. Vanessa avoided both of us that morning. She moved through the house quickly, gathering papers and personal items without speaking much. I watched her from the kitchen window while she carried a small stack of folders out to the garage office she had set up months earlier. Ethan remained calm but distant. He spent most of the morning on the phone with the legal advisor he had contacted earlier in the week. I could hear parts of the conversation as he walked slowly across the living room floor, speaking in a low, steady voice. The advisor confirmed what Ethan had already begun to understand. Because the house legally belonged to me, no financial action involving the property could happen without my permission. Any attempt to use it as collateral without my knowledge would have no legal standing. Hearing that brought me a quiet sense of relief I had not felt in a long time. Yet the situation had clearly left a deeper wound in Ethan. He was not angry in the loud or explosive way some people become during conflict. Instead, he seemed thoughtful and disappointed, as though he were slowly realizing how much trust had been broken. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Vanessa spoke privately in the living room. I remained in the garden trimming a few dry branches from the hydrangeas, giving them space to talk. The lake wind carried only fragments of their voices through the open window. What I understood was enough. Ethan explained that honesty was the foundation of any partnership. Vanessa tried again to defend her actions, saying she had only been exploring opportunities that could benefit their future. But Ethan now recognized that the plan involved using the house that belonged to me. When their conversation ended, Vanessa walked upstairs without another word. Over the next few days, she began packing some of her belongings. The house felt heavy with unspoken emotions, as boxes appeared near the staircase and suitcases waited beside the door. I never wanted my son's marriage to end this way. Watching him move through the house with quiet determination filled me with both sadness and relief. Families are complicated things. Love and disappointment often live in the same place. One evening, Ethan joined me outside in the garden while the sun lowered slowly across Lake Superior. He looked out at the water for a long moment before speaking. He said that this house would always remain my home. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I looked at the hydrangea bushes Daniel once planted beside the fence. Their leaves moved softly in the evening breeze. For the first time in months, the house beside the lake felt steady again. And I knew that whatever came next, the home we had built together had survived the storm. Several months passed after Vanessa left the house beside the lake. Winter arrived quietly in Lakewood, covering the shoreline with snow and turning the surface of Lake Superior into a cold gray mirror. During those months, life slowly returned to a rhythm that felt familiar again. The tension that once filled every room faded little by little. Without the constant conversations about property values or financial plans, the house felt calm again. The quiet I once feared losing had returned. Ethan remained living with me. In the evenings, he often worked on small repairs around the house. He strengthened the wooden boards along the porch and replaced several planks on the dock that had grown weak over the years. Watching him move carefully across the old wood reminded me of Daniel doing the same work decades earlier. My health also began to stabilize. I followed the doctor's advice, rested when I needed to, and avoided the heavier work in the garden. When spring finally arrived, I returned slowly to tending the hydrangea bushes Daniel loved so much. Their leaves grew again, bright and strong against the fence beside the yard. One quiet evening, Ethan joined me on the porch as the sun lowered across the water. We sat without speaking for several minutes while the lake reflected the soft colors of the sky. Moments like that reminded me of something important. The house beside Lake Superior was never valuable because of its price or the land it occupied. Its real worth came from the life built inside its walls, Daniel's laughter, Ethan's childhood, and the countless quiet mornings we shared together had given the house its meaning. Difficult seasons sometimes test the strength of a family, but they also reveal what cannot easily be taken away. As I watched Ethan walk down toward the dock that evening, I realized that despite everything that had happened, the most important parts of my life were still here. The home we built had endured, and so had we. Some homes are built with wood and stone, but their true strength comes from the memories they protect. Time has a way of testing what we believe is secure. Challenges arrive quietly, sometimes through disappointment, sometimes through betrayal, and they force us to see people and ourselves more clearly than before. Yet hardship also reveals something deeper. It reminds us that dignity does not come from ownership or power, but from patience, honesty, and the courage to stand firm when life becomes uncertain. In the end, truth has a quiet strength of its own. It does not rush, but when it finally appears, it restores balance in ways we rarely expect. The storms we face often pass, but the lessons they leave behind remain. They remind us what truly matters: integrity, resilience, and the simple peace of knowing that some things in life cannot be taken away. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories like this.